The South Dakota Senate passed HB 1080 yesterday, which protects children in the state from harmful and permanent gender treatments. Here's South Dakota State Representative Bethany Soy.
We care deeply about children who are struggling with their identities and want to provide them with true, meaningful help, not permanent physical damage.
The bill now heads to Governor Kristi Noem's desk for her signature. She's indicated she supports the measure. As we've covered on Washington Watch, this common sense legislation to protect children has been controversial, even in deep red South Dakota, due to the deep pockets and donations of Sanford Health, a major employer in the state that pushes these treatments for children. Joining me now to discuss all of it is Norman Woods. He's the executive director at Heritage Family Alliance in the Mount Rushmore State. Norman, welcome to Washington Watch.
Hey, thanks for having me, Joseph.
Good to see you. Talk to us about the bill. Did it accomplish what you hoped it would accomplish?
Oh, absolutely. So we're super excited to see the Help Not Harm bill pass through the Senate. And again, on such a strong vote. So you saw on the House side, it was 60-10. On the Senate side, it was 30-4. Really glad to see such a strong vote on such a strong piece of legislation. You know, it covers all the different angles. It stops the puberty blockers on minor children, the cross-sex hormones, and the irreversible surgeries, and gives them a chance later in life to come back for damages if they were victimized by these things.
And let's talk a bit about that last part of this idea that you can come back for damage if they are victimized. This seems to be a trend in these forms of legislation. This would allow a minor who goes through this transition procedure 5, 10, 15 years later to come back and sue the person who did that, the providers. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the age is set at 25 or 3 years after you know or should have known of the harm. So, to be honest, we would have liked to see that be a little bit longer, but it's just one of those compromises that you make through the process. So we set it at 25 or 3 years after the harm, or if you knew or should have known.
Yeah. Do you expect that to have a deterrent on medical providers? And I use the term medical provider loosely in this sense, but on providers who would be tempted to either prescribe these drugs or actually perform these surgeries?
I think that paired with the other teeth in the bill, which is that if a provider is found to be doing this, then they will lose their medical license from their governing board. I think when you add those two things together, it's a really strong deterrent. And I really think these will be stopped here in South Dakota.
Now, Norman, you mentioned the margins that this passed by. Strong majorities in both the House and the Senate. Did that surprise you in light of how hot this issue is?
Yeah, we were definitely surprised. There were a lot of people who previously weren't on board with this issue that voted yes to support it. So we were definitely surprised, but incredibly grateful at the huge margins that it passed with.
So what do you attribute that to? If this wasn't necessarily what you expected, why do you think you got such wide majorities in both houses of the legislature?
I think there's several things that have changed because South Dakota was actually the first state to try one of these bills back in 2020. Representative Fred Deutsch, 1057. But several things have changed since then. First of all, just the culture and people's awareness of the issue. We've seen, swimmers take titles from girls, biological boys take it from girls. We've seen all sorts of different stories of people coming out who have said, like Chloe Cole, who's had these surgeries done and is now speaking across the nation saying this is not what we need to be doing to children. So we have more and more stories, more and more cultural awareness, first of all. Then here in South Dakota, people are just more waking up. We saw recently Sanford Health had their Midwest Gender Identity Clinic where they were open and bold about the fact that they were inviting doctors from across the Midwest to come and learn more about these procedures. And people are really waking up. So when you add that to the fact that we had the governor's support this year right out of the gate, it was just a totally different ballgame this time. And that's, I think, why we saw the really different results in the vote.
And you mentioned their Sanford Health again. We talked about them in the opening to the segment. They've been they're benefiting from this because they have been providing some of these treatments. Is this a function of the leadership of South Dakota saying, Sanford Health, you're just wrong. We don't care what you think, because public support is clearly on the side of protecting children in this way? Has Sanford changed at all, or is it the politicians that have just developed a spine?
I think this is just the politicians and our legislators really showing leadership and saying, no, we're stopping this here in South Dakota. Sanford didn't testify in any of the committees. And from what I saw, they didn't even give any statements to the media. So they just kind of stayed out of it this time, which was really interesting to see. And yeah, the legislators this year just stood up in South Dakota and said, nope, no more. No more chemical castrations, no more body mutilations. We're stopping this.
And it does seem to many of us like common sense. But Norman, one of the other issues here that I do want to address, your governor has kind of had some controversy around this issue in the past. She vetoed a bill that prevented men from participating in women's sports. She later went back and signed a bill that did the same after public backlash. But you mentioned that she was supporting this out of the gate. Did something change for her on this issue? Why do you think you had her support so early?
So I don't want to speak to her, personal reasons. I haven't had a discussion with her about why she personally, supported this year versus last time. But I think all those issues I previously mentioned of the public awareness, the cultural awareness, and just that it's so obviously happening here in South Dakota, I think all of that played a role into her realizing that this is really something that she can lead on. And if I have my facts right here, she will be the first governor in the US this year to sign a full help not harm bill. So she just, I think, has realized that she can show leadership on this, and we're really grateful to see it.
We are grateful to see it. That is true. And we are grateful to her on behalf of the whole country. And to that point, Norman, what's your sense of whether what you're doing in South Dakota this year, and it certainly is not the first state to pass legislation like this, but it's on the leading edge. Do you expect this to continue to build momentum? You mentioned the stories of detransitioners, the public kind of being educated on this issue. Do you think that we're at the beginning of a wave of legislation like this that's going to protect children in significant parts of the country?
I do. And we've been seeing all sorts of bills introduced. I think there's like 7 or more in the process right now, with more to come. As we were finishing our hearing and wrapping up, we were literally listening to one in Nebraska and all these other states that I really do think that people are rising up, people are seeing what's going on, and more states are saying, no, we're going to stop doing this here. We're going to stop mutilating kids. We're going to stop these experimental procedures, and we're going to give kids help, not harm. I really do think we're starting to see a movement in that direction.
And that is encouraging. And Norman, we know that this is a lot of work, and that when we have days like this that are good and we celebrate legislation that passes, we know that you and your team have done a lot to make this happen. So we're grateful for it. We're also grateful for you spending some time with us today. Thanks so much.
Hey, glad to join you. Thanks for having me.